All right, good afternoon. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Tuesday, April 24th webinar, Defining Your Office 365 External Sharing Strategy. My name is Peter Carson. I'm going to be presenting for the next hour or so. I'm the president of Extranet User Manager and Envision IT, also a SharePoint MVP and a partner seller with Microsoft Canada. We're going to be posting a copy of the deck up on our website, and we'll send a follow-up email afterwards as well, so you'll have all my contact information in there. Also on the call today, Logan Guest. Logan's our sales guy, so he's in charge of all things questions, trials, demos, anything you want to do from a follow-up point of view. Please reach out, and again, his contact information will be in there as well. All right, so just jumping right in, and let's have a look at what we're going to talk about today. So we've done quick introductions. I'm going to do a little background on extranets as a whole, and then specifically around Office 365. We're going to kind of take two approaches to that. We're going to look at the out-of-the-box experiences and what that looks like. We're also going to look at our Extranet User Manager product, its feature set, and some demo and customer scenarios through there as well. And really, where does one make sense and where does the other make sense? Because we don't see them as competing. They really fit different niches, and we want to make sure people understand what those niches are and where the right tool is for the job. All right, let's start. The focus is primarily around SharePoint. A lot of the technology we're going to be talking about here today addresses sites more broadly than that, but really, a lot of what we've working with in Office 365 and sharing is around document collaboration, and SharePoint is kind of the primary place to do that. Within SharePoint, though, there's really three places to do that work. There's your OneDrive for Business, which is private by default, but you can share that out not only to your team members, but to external users, and we'll talk about that scenario. Team sites where you do collaboration, typically, smaller working group, everybody's contributing into there. And then communication sites, which are more of a publishing model where you want to publish content out to a broader audience, much smaller set of content authors and much larger numbers of consumers coming into those sites. So those are kind of the three different areas that we're going to cover off. And beyond that, or I guess above that, is also Office 365 groups. I'm not going to get too detailed into what these are. If you're familiar with them, great. If you're not, really think of them as a collection of all the different workloads of Office 365 tied together from a collaboration point of view. So you see down in the bottom row, sort of third from the left, the SharePoint site, it's only one of many different elements in there. You've got your OneNote, the stream videos, Power BI, planners, Outlook emails and calendars, Teams, Yammer feeds, all become part of Office 365 groups. And it's a great way to collaborate more broadly as well. And later we'll talk about how you can do external sharing from an Office 365 group point of view as well. So let's start with some definitions. What is an extranet? It is a website. It's a site that you can come to, but it's intended for people outside of your corporate network. It's not members of your organization, whether it's partners, customers, vendors, what have you, but it does need to be secure. It's not a public-facing website that just anybody can come into and can consume content from there. It may be part of your public website. You could have a members-only portal, say, as part of your public website. That's a common scenario that we see. Or it could be a portion of your corporate intranet. Maybe you want to share out specific projects that you're working on with outside vendors, partners, and such from that point of view. Or it could be a purpose-built standalone extranet whose only purpose is to connect your staff with people outside of your organization. And all three of those are relevant scenarios, and we'll cover off some examples of different ones from each of those. Now, I mentioned in my intro that we're going to look at the out-of-the-box experiences in Office 365, as well as what our Extranet User Manager product builds on top of that, get a sense of what makes sense in which scenario. And the way I like to simplify that is coming down to what I call a one-to-few or a one-to-many style of extranet. So a one-to-few, imagine you're working with your lawyer and you've got some contracts going back and forth, or you've hired a creative design firm and there's design documents and half a dozen people need to work together on that. Or even you've got a board of directors or a board of advisors. Maybe there's 4, 6, 8, 12 people on that board that you want to be able to publish contents out to, have them collaborate in from that. But it's a fairly small group and it tends to be fairly collaborative. It's often document focused. And SharePoint Online in Office 365 is a great way to do that one-to-few. SharePoint Online is already exposed externally. You don't have to worry about how do I open up firewalls and bring in external people. It's built to do that already, and it works very well from that perspective. It's typically invitation only. You've got a small set of people that you're working with. You know who they are, and you're going to invite them into your site. Collaborating on documents, as I mentioned, is the typical scenario, whether they're just viewing those, uploading, downloading them, editing them, and it's often project focused. Now, the one-to-many example, though, is where we've got a much broader audience. Maybe we've got hundreds, thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of external users that we want to bring into our extranet. It still needs to be a secure website. It may have an anonymous public-facing section, but we need a way to get those large numbers of users onboarded and securely into the site. Self-registration is a common scenario there. You don't know necessarily who all the people are that you want to bring into that site. You want them to be able to discover it, maybe through links on your public website, through news releases, PR activity that you do, to drive people to that site. They can self-register, go through an approval process potentially, and then you can push that content out to them. It's often a one-way push. It's not so much a collaboration. There may be some limited feedback. Do they want to be able to like and comment information that they've got there? Or maybe have a Dropbox style spot where they can drop files in from an upload point of view. They can manage their own profile, and I'll show you examples of those. It could be a collaborative site, but we don't tend to see that when you get into the large numbers of users from a one-to-many type of scenario. So one of the first things we do when we're discussing with new clients about building an extranet for them, whether it's out of the box or with our product, go through a number of consideration steps. And the first one is really just identifying who's going to be coming into the extranet. Is there some sort of member database? Maybe you run a dynamic CRM or Salesforce that we need to integrate with as part of this. What does that look like? And who are the people that are coming in? Are you building a board of directors portal site? Maybe a members portal for a not-for-profit organization, a customer portal for a for-profit organization. And a single extranet may serve multiple different purposes. You may say, well, we want to have both a members portal and a board of directors portal that are separate and secure, so the board of directors information isn't visible to the members and vice versa, but we want to use the same infrastructure for both of those. So setting some priority, just saying, well, we want to launch the board of directors site first, then we'll follow that up with the members portal, sequence that out and understand what that looks like. The second thing we typically ask is, how are people going to come into the site? Do you know who those people are and you're going to invite them in? And typically that's a smaller known set of users. And there's some sort of central management of that or delegated management around those invitations. Or is it purely open and there's a self-registration process? So you can onboard large numbers of external users. You may have some workflows in there. You may have some auto approvals, depending on how the rules work, and we'll show you some examples of how we've gotten creative around that to support that and have the delegation around that approvals process. Next up is understanding how your extranet users are going to authenticate. Are they going to create an account on your extranet and use their email address and password to come in? We need to think about things like self-service password reset. Or are your customers on Office 365 themselves? That's actually a really convenient scenario because they're already authenticating to Azure AD, which is under the hood of Office 365. They can use their own credentials to come into your account. Or maybe you want to do social connections, allow people to use their Microsoft account, their Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter accounts as examples to be able to do that authentication. Again, it depends on the scenario. If it's a more corporate business-to-business focused, where the credentials and security is quite important, maybe using Facebook isn't appropriate. But if it's a members portal for a volunteer organization, Facebook may be an ideal situation. So again, think back to question number one: who are the users coming in? What sort of information do we have in the extranet? Helps answer the question of how are those users going to then authenticate. And what sort of interactions are they going to have once they actually sign into your extranet? Are they just going to access some published content, or do they need to actually collaborate on documents? Do they need to access team or project sites? Or maybe they want to become full-fledged members of Office 365 groups so they can use the team's persistent chat and planner boards and look at the Power BI digital dashboards, all those sorts of things become possible as being part of that Office 365 group. Which leads into what applications are going to be accessible. Is it strictly Office 365 apps, the traditional SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, or do you want to give them access to Teams, Planner, Yammer, some of the other apps from that point of view? Or maybe you have SharePoint on-premises, some third-party SaaS applications, even custom applications that you built yourself that you want the extranet users to be able to come into. So there's a number of different options around that. So let's come back and focus the first part of the talk on what is the external sharing experience out of the box with Office 365? what of those scenarios I just described does that apply well to? So in terms of who would be coming into the extranet, if you're going to be using it out of the box, it doesn't really matter. I mean, any type of external user. It could be board of directors, could be a members portal, could be a vendor portal, what have you. Typically, though, it's invitation only. There's not a self-registration component as part of the out of the box. There are some open source GitHub repository that Microsoft's made available for you to create your own self-registration as part of that, but I don't really consider that out of the box. How are the extranet users going to authenticate? Well, they're going to have to use Office 365 credentials or create their own Azure AD or Microsoft account through the system. And we'll talk about what that sign-in experience looks like and how that works. What interactions are they going to have? Really anything from that point of view, and they could be accessing any part of Office 365. So that's sort of the scenario for the out-of-the-box settings. And I'm going to draw from a session that Eugene Lind did at Ignite back in September last year on external sharing. He's got some good scenarios to explain how those work from there. So let me walk you through those. We won't have time for demo on these because we've got a fair bit to go over, but it'll give you a good sense of how this works with. So the first one is completely wide open, and this scares a lot of people to say, well, what do you mean I'm going to send an anonymous link that anybody who has that link has access to that document? That doesn't sound very secure. Well, it's not, but it's actually not any less secure than just forwarding the attachment to them itself. And that's really the scenario that it's looking to address, that rather than attaching documents, if you've got a working group and there's going to be a bunch of people working on that document, you really don't want attachments flying around. What you want to do is just create a shareable link to say, well, anybody who has this email has a link to that document, and they can now either view that document or edit it, depending on how I set up that link. And I can even set things like expiration dates on there to determine when that's going to be available for. So if we look at, on the left being your corporate staff in Contosa in this example, that link can get shared around internally within the organization, but anybody can forward that link on. In fact, on the right-hand side, you can see there's an external user who's received that link and has then forwarded it on to somebody else external. There's no restrictions against that. If you have the link, you can view the document, you can edit the document depending on how you've set up the rights on it. So it's very straightforward from that point of view. And you can set some notifications up from that if you want to be notified if somebody else is creating anonymous links to content that you're managing. Maybe you want to get an email notification telling you about that. You can make a decision whether that's appropriate or not from there. So, in the right circumstances, this actually makes a lot of sense. You want very quick and dirty. You don't want any access issues. You just want them to be able to view or edit that document. Just send them the link to the document. The next scenario that you see, and I should have clarified, these are all part of the modern experience. So if you're still using classic sites in Office 365, you do have to switch to modern to see the new interface here to be able to do all the sharing that I'm describing here. And I'll get to a minute in terms of how you can lock this down and put some administrative controls around this as well. So let's say you just want to send it to people in your organization. You don't want to mess around with security. You want to make sure that whoever gets that link can access that document. Maybe you don't even have rights to change the permissions on the item itself, but you have the rights to share. You can send that sharing link out. And again, you can decide whether it's view only or they're allowed to edit within that. And that can get passed around as much as you want within the organization. Anybody who's a staff member of Contosa that gets that link can then get to that document. But if anybody tries to forward that out to somebody external to the organization, those external people are not going to be able to use that link because it knows when you're signing in, are you a staff member or are you an external person? Now let's take the security up another notch from here and say, well, you know what? I don't want a link that anybody can just forward around. I want something that's tied to that person that I'm sharing it with, and it's for their eyes only. So in this scenario here, I'm going to send it to specific people. And what it does is it creates a secret key as part of that link. Now, the user that receives the link actually has to prove that they're the intended recipient for that. So let me walk you through what that looks like. So the first email on the left is the one that I would receive if somebody had shared, in this case, an Excel budget with me. So I click the link to say open the budget, and it's going to say, well, before I let you into this Excel, I need you to prove that you're actually who you say you are. So I'm going to send you an email, and you need to put that code in. So you have to type in that account verification code that gets sent to you. Once you've done that, then it opens up the Excel for you. So it ensures that the person that was named as the recipient for that sharing, and it can be multiple people, is the same person that's actually opening it. They have access to that email address that they were invited in from. So that's sort of the top level from there. In all three of these scenarios, you'll notice that we haven't done any login through any of these. We started with the anonymous link. You just click the link and you're good to go. We then had the internal users only, so they had to be signed in as staff members to be able to use the link. And then the third case here, where you're sharing it with specific external people, they have to prove that they own that email address by getting this verification code. But they don't actually need to sign in to Office 365. Now, doing this style of sharing only applies if you're sharing an individual document, like I did here, the budget.xlsx, or let's say an entire folder. But if I want to share an entire site or library, I'm not able to do this style. And that takes us to the next point, which is external sharing at the site level. So let's say I have a whole SharePoint site. I've created a customer site for one of my customers, and I want to share that whole site with them. I can't do that through the experiences I was just showing you before. I need to go back to the regular SharePoint permissions to do this. So I need to have rights to manage the permissions and be able to add that external user in from there. Now, in that case, that external user is actually going to need to sign in. Now, they don't need a subscription to my Office 365. It's not going to cost me or them any money to invite this external user in. What does need to happen, though, is they need to log in one of three ways. And it depends what type of individual email account you've invited in. If you've invited a partner who is using Office 365 themselves, it's actually really easy. They just use their regular credentials, same as they would log into their own Office 365. In fact, in most scenarios, when they click that link, they've already logged into their own 365 before they got the link, and they just go straight through. They don't see a login. So that's actually a very nice experience from that point of view. The next two get a little tricky. The second one is I've invited somebody who's got a corporate email, but it's not in Azure AD. And what happens is behind the scenes, Microsoft creates an account and a tenant for that user, lets them set a password, sets up password reset requirements, things like that, that allows them to then log in. So they go through a couple of steps to get that account set up the first time. Once they're in and good to go, then it's more seamless from that point of view. Same kind of thing happens in the third scenario, except that I've invited, say, a Gmail user or a Outlook.com or some telco provider consumer email domain. In that case, that account needs to be converted to a Microsoft account. So there's a couple of steps you go through. Obviously, if you're using, say, Hotmail or Outlook, those are already Microsoft accounts, but Gmail wouldn't be. You'd have to go through and create that Microsoft account. Then you can sign in and access what you've been invited into. So not as ideal onboarding experiences, and we've seen some pain with external users coming in those latter two scenarios where they just get confused and we're not really sure what we need to do. How do we accept this invitation? That's where we see some of the challenges there. Now I mentioned there's administration controls to be able to lock down how the out-of-the-box experience works. And there's actually a fair bit of control around it. And I'm not going to go deep into this. This is actually a whole talk on its own, just in terms of how you secure external sharing out of the box. But you can define, who can share to external users. You can let everybody share. You can lock it down to specific security groups, or you can say nobody can share externally. It's up to you as an administrator how you want to configure that. You can control who they can share with. Are they only allowed to share with authenticated users? Are you going to block or only allow certain domains? Are you going to allow anonymous sharing? So again, you've got a fair bit of granularity around that. What's going to be shared? Is it just specific sites, or do you want to actually bring in sensitive content and data loss protection controls that actually look for confidential content and prevent it from being shared externally? And then how those shareable links are going to be used. When you go to share, by default, are they enabled? Do they require an expiration date on them? Do you want to block them? Do you want to disable them entirely? Again, you've got a fair bit of control across that. The part that's a little confusing is you've got to do that in a bunch of different places. You have to go into the Office 365 admin to enable sharing. You have to then go into SharePoint and enable at a global SharePoint level. Then you have to go into individual site collections and enable it there. There was a challenge up until very recently that you couldn't actually manage it through the admin console for modern sites because they had their own preview admin console. That console has now gotten updated and it does have sharing controls in it as of about 2 weeks ago or so. So that's nice to see. So pretty much everything you can do without going to PowerShell. Obviously, you can do all this through PowerShell as well. Now, taking it up a level, we've talked about individual documents or folders, as well as whole SharePoint sites. What if we want to share out an entire Office 365 group? That is certainly allowed as well. Basically, they become a full-fledged member of that group. So when emails get sent to the group email address, they get sent out to those external users' emails. They have access to all the files and folders, the group site in SharePoint. They can participate in team chats in Teams. And we're seeing more and more workloads lighting up. I think Planner is either there now or about to be there, that they can participate in Planner boards for doing task management. So really lighting up the full featured functionality of Office 365 groups, not only for your internal staff, but external users as well. Now, obviously, at that level, those folks tend to be very involved in the project. Maybe they're working directly with you as a subcontractor on a project, and they need to be basically the same as a staff member within that group, is a typical scenario we see around that. Now, adding external users into groups, you can do it in a couple of ways. So there is a SharePoint site associated with every Office 365 group, and you can go through the external sharing on that SharePoint site, just like my earlier slides talked about for just out-of-the-box SharePoint sites, or you can actually add them to the full group. If you want to add them to the full group, you actually do that in Outlook. So you go over into the Outlook client, open up the group, manage the members of the group, and you can define either an owner or a guest for those external users from there. Okay, so I started the talk talking about one-to-few and one-to-many. We've really focused on the one-to-few and the out-of-the-box experiences with Office 365. So let's switch gears and talk about the one-to-many. So I don't have maybe a specific set of users that I want to invite in. I want to do self-registration. Maybe there's a public-facing anonymous portion of the site as well, more of a publishing model, pushing out private content. So let's look at how our Extranet User Manager product fits into that and how it extends what you can do out of the box from an Office 365 point of view. So I'm going to start by taking you through a feature walkthrough, and then we'll actually dive into the product itself. So there's two main components to the product. There's an end user portion, and then there's an administration portion. So the end user is where you would go to register a new account, to set your password, to manage your profile, deal with forgotten passwords, things like that. The administration side of it, while it's named admin, is actually intended for not just IT administrators, but delegated users as well. So the idea is that you can delegate within your business unit to say, hey, I'm going to make you an owner of this group, and you can invite people in and manage from that point of view. It actually really helps from a governance point of view. If you recall back when I was talking about sharing the SharePoint site out, that I needed to manage that through the SharePoint permissions, we can actually get away from that and say, okay, we're not going to give the individual business groups rights to manage permissions in SharePoint. What we're going to give them is access into this tool here, and they can just manage the membership of the group. They're not going to mess anything up from a permissions point of view because that's already all set up for them. All they need to do is decide who they want to invite into the site from there. So that makes it much more streamlined from that point of view. So you can search and add and import both users and groups, as well as administer the overall experience of the application itself. Now, branding is very important. Maintaining your corporate brand throughout that whole user experience, not just from a registration point of view, but all the end user pages, the login pages. That's a key feature of our product, is making sure that your brand is front and central throughout that whole experience. Delegation and self-registration, which is the next slide, are probably the two biggest things, though, that drive people towards using Extranet User Manager to say, hey, we want to delegate this out to the business. We don't want IT to be the gatekeeper around external users coming in. Maybe even we want to delegate it to the external organizations themselves, so that they can become an administrator of their own group and manage their staff coming into our extranet. So lots of different scenarios that you can envision from that point of view. And as I mentioned, self-registration, it's a very customizable registration experience. Every client's registration needs are a little different in terms of what fields they want to have there, what the approval process looks like, the business rules behind that, integration in with other back-end systems like CRM or Salesforce, the approval workflows and such as part of that as well. I note at the bottom there, Visual Studio source code project provided. There's actually less requirement for that now. We've completely revamped our architecture, and most of the registration customizations you can do right through HTML and JavaScript as well. So it makes it much easier to do that branding and customization. Forgotten password is very important. You know, you've created credentials for your external users and they haven't been to your site in 6 months and they don't remember them anymore. You don't want them picking up a phone and calling you. You want them to be able to self-serve through that process. Beyond the forgotten password, we also now provide support for social identity. So if you want to log in through, say, Facebook or Google, you don't actually need a password for that. You just need to be able to federate through, click the login with Google link. As long as I'm logged into Google, I'm now into your extranet from there. So it's a very streamlined process from that point of view. Multi-factor authentication. This has actually changed recently. We were using some Azure components to do multi-factor authentication. They've deprecated that functionality. It's no longer available to our new clients. So we've actually built that into the core product itself now, that when somebody comes to log in, we can go through some configurable rules that say, should I or should I not go through a second factor authentication for this user? You know, did they forget their password the last time? Did they do an incorrect password attempt? Those can all be triggers to decide, hey, we want to do a second factor authentication, which can either be an email sent to them or an SMS text message. They respond with a code from that into the login form, and then away they go from there and they're into the site. We can also use this for email revalidation, which is actually a really important thing. Even if you're using the social identities, making sure that the people that are coming into your extranet still belong to the organizations that they were initially invited into. You know, my email is peter@envisionit.com. Let's say you invite me to your extranet, I start using it. 6 months from now, I move to a new position at a new organization, and I no longer work at Envision IT. You wouldn't know that. You know, there's no way for you to find that out, and typically organizations aren't going to tell their partners, hey, this person has left our organization, you need to remove them from your systems. It's just too much work to do that. So the email revalidation basically says, hey, every 3 months or 6 months or whatever frequency you decide, as they log in, they're going to have to go through that second factor authentication with their email to confirm that they still own that email address. So it's a nice simple way to make sure that the people that are coming into your extranet actually still work for the organizations that they belong to according to the extranet. From a support point of view, I mean, our focus today is around Office 365, but we do support SharePoint 2010, 13, and 16, soon to be 2019 as well. I don't see any big changes coming from an authentication point of view down the pipe from that, but we'll learn a lot more, I would imagine, at Ignite or at the SharePoint Conference North America coming up next month. Coincidentally, we're going to be exhibiting down there. So if you're at that conference, that's late in May down in Las Vegas, by all means, can come by. Both Logan and I will be there for that event. It's a fully adaptive design. You know, it is a mobile-first world. We got to make sure that our web interfaces work well on smartphones, tablets, as well as desktops. So it leverages the Bootstrap framework, which is a very common framework for building responsive designs. We can host it for you in Azure. Soon, actually, we're planning on providing the ability for you to host it yourself in your own Azure tenant, or you can put it onto your own servers. It really just needs an IIS box to run in from that point of view. The idea of hosting it in Azure going forward is to set it up as an app service that, you know, for very low cost, Microsoft manages that service for you, takes care of a lot of the care and feeding from that point of view. So let's go through a quick demo of what this looks like. So I've got a couple of browser windows open here. Let me pull both of them up. This one is timed out. Let me sign back in here. There we go. Okay, I'm going to run two browsers side by side. Hopefully this will make sense. Really, the left-hand side is the extranet user that's coming in, and the right-hand side is the owner/administrator of that extranet. So this is our admin console that I was talking about before. I'm logged in as a top tier configuration editor, which means I get to do things like, you know, configure emails and define how the system as a whole works, as opposed to other users that might just have the ability to add and edit users. So let's come to our left-hand side here. You can actually use this URL yourself if you want. It's a publicly available SharePoint 2016 site. And the top-level site is anonymously available. So anybody can see what I'm seeing here, but if I want to come in and access the private site, I'm going to need to sign in and have rights into that. And that's kind of the demo scenario that I'm going to take you through. So I say, okay, I want to access the private site. First thing, SharePoint's going to say, well, you're not logged in. I need you to kick you over to the Extranet User Manager login, where you decide, are you going to log in with Google, Facebook, LinkedIn? I'm going to keep it simple and go through the email password scenario. But right now, let's imagine I don't even have an account on here yet. I'm not a member yet. I need to create an account. So I click that link. I say, yep, I want to do the password scenario. So I need to fill in my information. So the only required fields in our registration form is first name, last name, and email. We've got a bunch of others for examples here. And this can be fully customized. I'll show you some examples later from customer scenarios from that point of view. Okay, so I've got it all ready to go. Go ahead and hit register. Now, a couple things are going to happen as I register through here. So first is I'm going to get a confirmation email just thanking me for registering on the portal. But it's set up for approvals, so I'm going to need to wait for a second email once I'm approved before I can set my password and actually go into the site. So let's come over to my mailbox here. I've got a couple of emails that have come in here. So the first one, this is the thank you one saying, hey, thanks for requesting an account. Now the second one, I'm actually using the same mailbox for both purposes, actually is to me as the administrator saying, hey, a new user here, Peter Carson 3, has just registered. You need to edit their record and set their status to active. Now I'm going to do that over on this side here because I'm logged in as the admin over here. So let me just do a search. Put in my name. We can see there's my Peter Carson 3 that I just created, currently pending approval. So if I click on that to open it up and say I want to edit this user, I can see all the information that was entered by that user. There's some additional fields that I may keep in here that aren't visible to the extranet user. If everything looks good there, though, I'm just going to switch them from pending approval to active. And I need to put them in a group because they want to be able to access a SharePoint 2016 site that I was trying to go to there. So let's click on that SharePoint 2016 private group. And what it's doing is putting them into that group. I'll go ahead and update that. So it's now marking them as active. It's going to send out the welcome email to that user. Let's do one more thing though. Let's actually go over to that group itself so I can see the members of that group. I've done a couple of dry runs through here to set up some scenarios. I'm actually going to add the user that I just created as an owner for this group as well. And I'll explain in a minute what that does and what that means. Okay, so if I look back over here, I've got my welcome email that's come in now. Saying, hey, welcome to the extranet. Your username is your email address. We like to do that. Keeps it simple for people. They only have to remember their password. And I need to set a password to be able to come in. So let me click on that link there. And like I mentioned before, I could use my Google or Facebook. I'm going to go through the password scenario. You can define what your password complexity rules are. We've got some visual indicators down at the bottom here that show me, when I've correctly typed in things so people can understand what a complex password looks like. And I go ahead and set the password. Now I haven't actually logged in yet. I've just set my password. So if I hit my home link here, it's going to take me to the login, and I'm going to have to use that. Saved my old credentials in there, so let me take that out. And we have the option of putting up a disclaimer page. So it's lorem ipsum in our example here, but you can have your terms and conditions on here, and we record that people have accepted those terms and conditions into the database from an audit point of view. In fact, we keep auditing on all activities. So when the person registers, who approves them, any profile changes made, any group changes made, owners, that's all audited and tracked in the underlying database. You've got a full record of exactly what's happening from that point of view. So now I'm back to the home page of the end user components. I can go straight into SharePoint, but let's take a quick tour around here first. Let's say I want to go to my profile page. I'm signed in as that pcarson3 user. I can see and update my profile information. In this scenario, we let people change their email address. Often we lock that down because people don't want someone who's left the organization changing their email to a personal email, say for example, and continuing to have access. So that depends on the scenario as to whether you want to allow that or not. I can come into the change password. As long as I know my old password, I can set a new password from there. Even if I forgot my password on the login screen, there is a forgot password link there. I put in my email address, it sends me a one-time expiring token for me to set my password, and away I go from there. So let's actually go to the SharePoint site now. So this is taking me into the private site that I was originally trying to get into at the beginning here. Now you notice that SharePoint didn't actually prompt me for login. So that's an example of single sign-on. I was signed on to this site here. I clicked a link to go to SharePoint. SharePoint went back to our Extranet User Manager product, which said, hey, this person's already signed in, pass back its credentials, and single sign-on takes me through from there. So you can have many different applications, each having their own authentication, all tied back into Extranet User Manager, and people have a nice single sign-on experience across all of that. Now, let's talk a bit more about making this user an owner of this group and what that means. So if I click on this link here to go to Landing Admin, you would expect, hey, this is an external user. They wouldn't normally have access into the admin console. But because I made them an owner of a group, they actually have the ability to search and import and edit users. They don't see all the groups management, they don't see all the configuration settings in there because they don't have that level of access. In fact, if I come into search user on the left here and hit the search button, I see 3 users coming back. If I go on the right here as the administrator and search, hey, I've got 13 people over here, why are these different? Well, the reason they're different is we've configured the system to say, hey, if we've got group owners coming in, only give them access to the members of the group that they own. So they don't see other group members. And this is a scenario we see a lot where you're delegating externally. So imagine that you've got 3 different partners, you designate an owner at each of those partners who then manages the user from their partners to come into your extranet. Obviously don't want them, partner A to see partner B's staff, so they would only see their own members through this scenario here. So you can get quite flexible in terms of how you structure the security around the product from there. In fact, even the ability to say, well, I don't want the external owners to be able to download a template and import in a whole whack of users. That may not be something I want to permit. So I can actually turn that off and say, well, we're going to only allow group editors and configuration editors to do that, not group owners. So this whole idea of delegated management is throughout the whole product. We have the ability to manage groups and who belongs to those and decide who owns those groups and who manages the users within those groups as well from there. So if we look back at this private site here, I'm logged in currently as a user here. We've actually granted permissions to this site through the group that we made the user a member of. So the beauty there is I've got this SharePoint 2016 private group here that's got permissions applied. Once I've done that, all I need to do is add people into this group and they automatically get access to this site. I don't have to do any different changes on the permissions in SharePoint itself as part of that. So it makes it quite flexible from that point of view. And from a governance perspective, that's really important. You probably don't want to let everybody manage permissions in SharePoint, but you do want to let a fairly broad set of users manage who they're sharing externally with. Otherwise, you get back into that gatekeeper situation where IT is blocking that. And what ends up happening then is people just find their own ways around that. They'll just email attachments, they'll set up a Dropbox or an FTP site or all sorts of things from a shadow IT point of view that you really don't want to have happen. You want to keep them within the fold, make sure that they're able to get done what they need to get done. So that's a quick walkthrough. There's certainly a lot more features there, but I wanted to give people a quick sense of registration, onboarding, and how that would go through from there. So let's actually switch gears and go through a couple of customer case studies here. The first one I want to talk about is Associated Engineering. So Associated Engineering is a consulting engineering company, 23 offices, I think, across Canada, about 900 staff. Mid-sized organization, but a lot of projects that they do. They are consulting engineers. Their business is running projects, and these projects are huge. It could be as large as a multi-billion-dollar, multi-year highway bypass around the city of Regina is one of the incentives to get this project going, just to manage something on that scale. They had an on-premises SharePoint they were doing this with, but that quickly got out of hand. They needed high availability, disaster recovery, and rather than investing that on premises, it just made a lot of sense to move that into Office 365. So that's what we did about a year and a half ago, worked with them to migrate to Office 365. set up the external partner access through Azure AD B2B, which is a feature that allows you to share sites or individual documents from SharePoint out through Office 365. And we've actually built support for Azure AD B2B on our product on top of that. So, they're up over 1,000 external users now. That's getting to be a fairly large number of people to manage. And just managing that through the native sharing would be a little bit onerous. So we use Delegation and Extranet User Manager to set up those groups and manage things from that perspective. They've got the high availability and disaster recovery in Office 365. And we also worked with them to build out some project site creation automation. I've actually got a white paper up on our site. We'll make sure we send it out as a link as a part of the follow-up around the work that came out of associated engineering and turned into a whole open source project around the site creation, site management side of things. So what does this look like? The idea is that you request a new project site through a request form. There's a workflow approval process that goes through that, creates the new site, sets it up for you, but it also wires into Extranet User Manager. So the new architecture of Extranet User Manager that we've had for the last year or so basically exposes all the functionality, not just through the browser, but through APIs as well. So that workflow can actually call out and create groups in EUM. You can assign permissions in SharePoint to those groups and basically wire it all up together from there. Now this is another of our roadmap features that we're working on. On the right-hand side here is a new SharePoint Framework web part to actually display the members of the groups. So the idea is it would use those same APIs to talk to Extranet User Manager, say, okay, who are the members of the different groups associated with this particular site that I'm in right now, and just show a list right on the page itself. And if I'm a group owner, let me just add users, edit users right through this interface right here. Or if I'm not, at least let me link to their emails and phone numbers and use it as a site or a project contact list. So that's a lot of flexibility, and it lets people work entirely in SharePoint. They don't need to manage permissions, manage the external invitations, anything else. They just manage their list of project members. Everything else is automated behind the scenes from there. Yeah, so we've already covered the overview side of things. Let's switch gears to the next one here that I want to talk about is the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. So OCAS is an organization of about, I think, 65 people working in Toronto, but they're responsible for providing training and resources to about 8,000 staff and volunteers across the 50+ member children's aid societies across the province of Ontario. They get a lot of provincial funding to provide that training and resources. And they did have a previous portal that just didn't work well for them to deliver that out. So we standardized on Office 365, and we actually integrated single sign-on into Desire to Learn as well, which is their learning management system they use as part of the portal too. So we provide single sign-on to both Office 365 and to D2L to those folks coming in through there. So net result, we've got that hosted up in Office 365. We've got auto approval of most accounts. So there is a self-registration form available as part of that. In fact, if I click on this link to go to ocas.sharepoint.com, whoops, doesn't like that link out of Office 365. Bear with me a sec. Because I've got too many identities logged into Office 365 as well. So an incognito window, gone to ocas.sharepoint.com, and it brings up our Extranet User Manager login form. So even though this is an Office 365 site, we can take over the login process, put our own registration in front of that, manage that whole process through there. So if I click the Register Here link to say, well, I don't currently have an account on here, you're going to see that it bears a lot of similarity to the form I was showing you before, but it has their own custom fields, like which Children's Aid Society do you work for? Are you here in Toronto, and what's your role within that organization? It knows the address information. And the key piece here is that we'll do an auto approval if you fill in an email address that matches the domain of the organization you say that you're registering for. Because we know that you're going to have to receive that email, and that'll verify that you actually work for Children's Aid Society of Toronto. So that really simplifies things. At its peak, when we were launching this site out, we were onboarding, I think it was about 500 new external users per day. So getting that volume of people onboarded in the system just wouldn't be manageable through a manual invitation or even a manual approval process. So the auto approval took care of virtually all of those, let us ramp up to quite a few thousand external users very quickly through there. The next one is an interesting scenario. It's a bit of Office 365, but it's also Azure and a public website. So Ontario MD is a not-for-profit here in the province of Ontario, and its mandate is to provide services around the adoption of electronic medical record systems to physicians and their staff across the province. And they had an existing website, but it was very old, it was very expensive to maintain, and they were really looking for an update from that. And it was not just a public-facing website, it had to be a private member portal as well. So what we proposed was to say, well, let's use SharePoint Online as your content management system, because they were already an Office 365 customer, but let's actually publish that content out into an Azure website. So if I go back to my browser here, and I go to the Ontario MD site, and again, you can hit this site. It's been live for just coming up to its first year anniversary now. You can see that this is a fully responsive, highly available, public-facing website that also has a sign-in and registration process to that. If I click on that sign-in link, we're going to take over to our Extranet User Manager sign-in. Same sort of process that we saw before, where I sign in with an email address and a password. Registration here is a little bit different because I need to prove first that I'm actually a physician in the province. So I need to provide my OMA number and date of birth, and it'll go through another couple of verification steps to confirm that I actually am a registered physician before I can create my account in there. Once I have my account, though, this is where the delegation comes in. As a physician, I can then sponsor other users in my office. Typical scenario is a physician registers, they sponsor their office manager as a managing user themselves, who then invites in all the other users from there. So this is a nice example where we've delegated the access out externally from that point of view. Now, how does the Office 365 and Azure piece fit together? Well, the idea was that we wanted to leverage Azure websites, which are actually quite cheap. We're paying $219 times 2 for 2 dedicated servers to host this environment in. But the beauty of it is that they're patched and maintained by Microsoft. We don't need to do anything around the care and feeding of those. And then they used a hosted version of our Extranet User Manager product as part of that as well. It's an enterprise edition because they're not just accessing the website, they have their own custom apps and SaaS applications they're doing single sign-on into as well. And the way it all hangs together is we've got our Office 365 and SharePoint on the left-hand side here, where the content authors come in to do all their content authoring, and we can use the rich workflows and approval processes in Office 365. So, new content, depending on where it is in the site, may require business approval. It always requires communications team approval before it goes live on the site. Once that approval happens, though, it actually pushes that content from SharePoint Online out into the Azure website, which is what you're seeing when you hit the OntarioMD.ca site. You're actually not hitting Office 365 at all. You're hitting the Azure website here. We're using Azure Search to provide a good search experience around that, and Extranet User Manager to provide the sign-in as part of that as well. So this whole environment here is hosted by Microsoft and managed in a very cost-effective way through there. If we look at the financial results around that, the operating cost of the entire solution is less than just the maintenance fees on their old Oracle solution that they had there before. They were able to decommission a whole whack of dedicated hosted virtual machines and no longer have to do the care and feeding on those as well. So I'm actually running a little ahead of time for a change. Here we go. Looks like I'll give you a few minutes back. I want to just wrap up on a couple of points in here, though. First is that there is a lot of different ways to share in Office 365. I probably should have done a summary slide in retrospect. I should probably add that in. We went through a couple of ways from an on-premise, whether we were sharing an anonymous link, we were sharing to people within our organization, we were doing a specific person sharing, or requiring a sign-in into the site as a whole. Those were sort of the 4 scenarios that we covered off from an out-of-the-box perspective. And that's really works well for small groups or specific documents or sites. As it starts to scale beyond that, governance becomes a challenge, and you need to have some better process in place. And that's really where the Extranet User Manager comes in. In the one-to-many scenarios, where we're either publishing out to a broad set of groups like Ontario MD or OCAS, or even in a collaboration sense like associated engineering, where we're getting into thousands of external users. To scale to that level, we needed things like the site request form, the provisioning of the sites, and a consistent way to manage those external users. So really think about your scenario. Is it one to few? Is it one to many? Maybe there's a need for both of them. I would say that we use both at Envision IT ourselves. If I'm sharing documents out to a small group just for a quick ad hoc working, I'll use the out-of-the-box sharing features. If we have customers coming into a customer site, we use our Extranet User Manager from there. So there's a lot of advantage to delivering both, each in their own specific scenario. So from there, I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. Wish you a great rest of your day. And like I mentioned, we'll send out an email follow-up in a day or so. We'll have a recording of the session as well as a download version of the deck that you can look at. All right, thanks again. Take care.